Hi, my name is Frank Schaefer, and I would like to argue today that there is no such thing as Christian nationalism in America today. There is rather a movement of white nationalism that has supplanted the Christian nationalist movement if it ever existed. I come from an evangelical background. When the New York Times did an article on a memoir of mine called Crazy for God, it said that I had been a member of evangelical royalty, as they put it, because my parents, Francis and Edith Schaefer, were famous evangelical leaders. In fact, my dad is credited, if you want to use those words, with starting the evangelical wing of the pro-life movement in the late 1970s, along with C. Everett Koop, who became Ronald Reagan's Surgeon General. And I wrote and directed the scripts of the films that were shown to tens of thousands of American evangelicals that began what in fact was evangelicals joining Roman Catholics to create this enormous movement called the pro-life movement. That's my background. But let me get back to this issue of Christian nationalism versus white nationalism. Christian nationalist extremism is a violent ideology at its core. Thousands of American white evangelical pastors, for instance, carry guns and are proud of doing so. They say they are defending their rights, not to just be gun owners, but against government oppression, and that's the excuse. They, of course, have been notably absent in defending ordinary American citizens against actual government oppression, for instance, by ICE agents shooting a mother of three in the face, or a nurse who worked at a Veterans Administration hospital taking care of the kind of people my son was when he was in the U.S. Marine Corps fighting 2 tours of combat in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq. American nationalism asserts that the U.S. was a Christian nation in its beginning, and it's linked to anti-democratic views these days and support for political violence, if need be, to overthrow what they regard as creeping secular humanism and liberalism fomented by the Democratic Party and other leaders. Adherents often say they are reclaiming the nation, including reclaiming the nation from non-Christians, Jews, Hindus, Muslims, and others who have taken over public life. And key details regarding this extremism are these. Proponents argue that the federal government should be replaced by a Christian government and base its laws on the Bible rather than on the Constitution. That is a radical and extreme position that tens of thousands of evangelicals hold to. The ideology is linked to the January 6th insurrection and attacks on abortion providers, something I know about because some of them wrote to my father thanking him for his books, and then were accused of bombing abortion clinics or shooting down abortion doctors. And roughly 1/3 of Americans these days subscribe to some form of this ideology, with a higher concentration among Republicans, about 55%, and white evangelicals being the majority. The key drivers of this movement are a feeling of victimhood, a belief that our culture, speaking for the evangelicals, is under siege from secularists and liberals, and many conspiracy theories have burgeoned because of this. Anti-vaccination theories, all the rest of it. Experts and some Christians themselves now argue that this movement is a distortion of the gospel because, for instance, it's created a bestseller out of a book by a woman who argues against Christian empathy, saying that that is weakness, that we must not be empathetic to people, for instance, being shot in the face by ICE agents, but rather realize that we have to be stern in our views. And this is kind of a Christian fascism nationalism that has replaced the teachings of Jesus, to the point where Jesus is actually an enemy if taken seriously in his teachings. He would be described as a liberal or woke by these people. And how did this predictable evangelical family values group that my father influenced so greatly in the 70s and 80s become an anti-democratic movement offering to hang a vice president who wouldn't back Donald Trump's assertion that the election had been stolen? Well, The Rise and the Radicalization of the New Christendom is a book by Kerry Ladner that traces this transformation through the rise of dominionism, which is a part of the theological movement of evangelicalism my dad was part of, a radical strain of evangelical Christianity that frames political authority and a biblical mandate, as they call it, and treats democracy less as a safeguard than as an obstacle to be overcome. And for instance, I knew one of the fathers of dominionism, Rusas Rushdoony. I used to stay in his home, and he would argue that the U.S. Constitution was the enemy of the idea of Christianity being superior to all human systems. We didn't need a constitution, we just needed the Bible, according to him. Moving from the early 20th century, Pentecostal charismatic revival movement, which has taken over a big chunk of evangelicalism with advisors to Donald Trump like Paula White whispering in his ear, basically have come to a place where they regard us as a kind of a chosen nation, a new Israel. In fact, many anti-Semitic evangelical anti-Zionists are now arguing that a great mistake was made in backing Israel in 1948 and that we should have declared evangelical Christianity as the only true Israel on earth, something you don't hear them talk about much, but is very real. The result is a fast-growing religious movement that promises spiritual power and a national renewal, even as it replaces democracy with this new ideology of a Christian nation, very much the same as ISIS did in terms of an Islamic caliphate overtaking elected or non-elected governments in the Middle East. And yet, this movement actually is hypocritical to the point where I'm claiming today that it doesn't really exist. What really exists is a white nationalist movement pretending to be a Christian nationalist movement. Why do I say this? Well, let's just take one point and throw a name out there, Stephen Miller, the long-standing white nationalist, racist, and anti-immigrant who has pioneered Donald Trump's program to hundreds of thousands of ICE agents spread across this country, arresting brown people. Why do I pause on that fact as a kind of proof that Christian nationalism doesn't exist and only white nationalism exists? Well, if you were a Christian nationalist and you wanted a majority of evangelical Bible-believing Christians, charismatic, Roman Catholic, Pentecostal, in this country, you would want wide open borders on our southern border. Why? Because unlike Europe, our southern borders do not border North Africa and large Islamic populations that threaten the Christian majority in Europe if they immigrate en masse, the kind of thing that Viktor Orban in Hungary has stood against, saying we don't want the Islamic hordes to come overwhelm our Christian nation, and the rise of the religious right in Britain with Farage and others, sometimes not so religious, but just the rise of the right, is a pushback against Islamic immigration primarily from Algeria and Afghanistan and all these other countries. Unlike their situation in Europe, in America, our southern borders South and Central American countries like Mexico or Brazil. For instance, Brazil is 1/3 Pentecostal Christian, the rest Roman Catholic, very religious nation. And the South and Central American countries are the same. So what I'm saying is if you look at the white nationalist movement, what it's doing makes sense with Stephen Miller, who ironically is Jewish and in the position of throwing out and arresting and exporting and repatriating and sending home and going against court orders, by the way, more than any other agency through ICE, Christians, evangelical Christians, Pentecostal Christians, Bible-believing Christians, charismatic Christians, Roman Catholic Christians, but who all have one thing in common: skin color that's brown or black. If you were interested in Christian nationalism and you wanted to outnumber the liberals who tend to have less babies and outnumber the Jews who are more secular in their outlook and more liberal, and outnumber the Hindu population and outnumber secular, non-church-going people who are white and who vote for Democrats, liberal, university-educated, white secularists and atheists and agnostics. What you would do is you would welcome and make it easy for Christians, believing Christians who go to church, to come to America. But if the movement is not actually Christian nationalist, but white nationalist, then you would have Stephen Miller and Donald Trump acting on your behalf to get rid of Christian brown people, because you don't really care about a Christian nationalist movement. You are backing a white nationalist movement, as leaked emails in 2015 to 2016 show from the Southern Poverty Law Center that were reviewed. When they looked at 900 emails Stephen Miller sent Breitbart news editors, the email showed an affinity for white nationalist literature in its extreme, including promoting white nationalist website, VDARE, and recommending the racist novel, The Camp of Saints. White nationalist ties, former Breitbart editor Katie McHugh stated that Miller assisted her in radicalization as a white supremacist. Reports also linked Miller to white nationalist figures such as Peter Brimlow and Richard Spencer. And then when you look at the anti-immigrant policies of the Trump-Miller ICE invasion of our cities and our towns and our factories and our Walmarts, arresting people, it's widely identified with Trump's racist policies and racist memes, including putting Donald Trump on his social media site, dumping this moral excrescence picture of Michelle Obama and Barack Obama as gorillas, all the way up to including his racist past, taking out full-page ads in the New York Times, lying about some kids arrested in Central Park, saying that they had mugged and raped somebody when in fact they were innocent. And you look at the condemnation by civil rights groups across the board following the release of these emails of Stephen Miller's. Over 50 civil rights groups, among them many Jewish lawmakers and other congressional Democrats, called for his removal. So the point is, we have an ironic situation, and that is that the anti-Semitic right wing, which I stand against, but Tucker Carlson is fine with, and invited Fuentes on his show, who's a Holocaust denier and a big fan of Hitler, without comment, invited him on his show. But what you don't hear about is Stephen Miller being denounced because he's Jewish, and he's formulated a program to expel millions of American wannabe Americans coming over our southern border illegally. Not just shutting the border, which, by the way, should have been done by Democrats, which is one reason Trump was elected. I believe in borders being patrolled and policed by the U.S. government to stop illegal immigration. But once people were in the country, having lived here 20, 30 years, raised kids here, in one case, a man who was arrested by ICE, thrown to the ground, hit, and dragged off in handcuffs, had 3 Marines who had served in the same force my son served with as a Marine. And yet he was arrested having lived here 30 years. His crime was that he was brown, a church-going Christian family raising Marines, but they're brown. So when you want to look here at what Miller and Trump are doing, it's the mass expulsion of brown Christians. This is something that the white evangelical Christian nationalists don't talk about. They don't talk about this. Why? Because they are not a Christian nationalist movement. They are a racist white nationalist movement masquerading as a Christian nationalist movement, because it's nicer to talk about returning America to its, quote, Christian foundation, something they've made up out of whole cloth, than it is to talk about race purity and ethnic cleansing based on skin color. But I would like to say right here and right now that while indeed the Christian nationalist movement has deep roots in the theonomy movement that my father was part of, Rousseff Rushdoony and others who believe that we ought to go back to an Old Testament law, replace the U.S. Constitution with a Christian idea of law, And that's what they bought into and thought Donald Trump would help them get there. That's not the point anymore. That's simply become a building block for something much bigger and wider. And that is an absolute return to Jim Crow racism in America that will eventually see a formalization in the law by the Supreme Court and by other courts appointed by Trump and others to bring us to a place where Black Americans, African Americans are also targeted, even as they are targeted today, informally but formally. I make a prediction. A country that throws out millions of Christians in the name of Christian nationalism is a hypocritical country that is actually fomenting race war on brown people. And we have the supreme irony that I've commented on elsewhere, that our vice president is married to a brown woman, that should she not be married to the vice president and swept under the carpet, her and her 3 brown children and 1 unborn baby would also be targeted by race agents, windows smashed of their cars, dragged by their hair from their cars, arrested as we've arrested many children and incarcerated them. And the only thing that protects certain people like that is that they are close to the regime. But when you have a situation when right-wing American Christians are okay with Stephen Miller's policy of dragging tens of thousands of Christians by their hair out of their cars and their places of work and arresting them at home, driving them into the street, arresting their children, the only thing that these people have in common, besides the fact that they are here illegally and being deported, which is a whole different thing than closing the border against future mass immigration that is illegal. These are 2 different things. ICE isn't doing what Trump ran on. He said he would make our border secure and arrest criminals. No, he's arresting 5-year-old children and using them as bait to get dads who are gardeners and moms who clean houses out of their houses. And these are Pentecostal Christians, charismatic Christians who go to church every Sunday. Go to church every Sunday and believe the same thing that pro-life white evangelical Christians believe. But if pro-life white evangelicals really wanted a movement that would overwhelm the pro-abortion movement as they see it, or overwhelm the secular movement, or reform our universities, they would be welcoming these millions of Christians and fighting Stephen Miller and saying, I'm sorry, you are not going to throw out millions of Christians that will bolster our numbers demographically for years to come. Instead, they are happy to be a white, angry minority that thinks they are victims, but they'd rather be that than welcome millions of Christians into America of a skin color they don't approve of. One other thing. If Christian nationalists wanted to be taken seriously, here's a few things they would be doing. And by the way, I do not recommend any of these things, but I'm telling you, if they were consistent, here's what they'd be calling for. First of all, they would ask for a travel and immigration ban from Northern Europe. Unchurched people, less than 1% of which go to church. And certainly no immigration whatsoever from countries like the United Kingdom, Germany, Scandinavia, where the public is not going to church or Christian or believing. In fact, they are university-educated secularists of the exact kind of liberal, Democrat voting Americans that the religious right decided to distrust and accused of doing things like Roe v. Wade and all the rest. They would demand of President Trump that immigration of white non-Christian Europeans be curtailed in favor of immigration of African Christians, in favor of immigration by Hispanic Christians, etc., if they were actually Christian nationalists, because that would burgeon the population. These people have babies, they have families, they send their kids to Sunday school, they speak in tongues, they're charismatic. By the way, this isn't me recommending this. I'm telling you, if Christian nationalism was consistent, that's what they'd be doing. They would say no more immigrants from Israel, no more Jews or Muslims in America ever. We want a Christian nationalist country, right? And so they would close the border to people like that. No more alliances with Israel. These are not people who are Christians. That's when you would take Christian nationalism seriously. Armed, Pentecostal, gun-carrying, evangelical pastors would interpose themselves in civil protests, peaceful protests, but interpose themselves, by the way, not recommending this, between ICE agents and Hispanic Bible-believing Christians whose kids would be in Sunday school if they weren't being arrested by ICE, if they weren't afraid to go to church because they would be arrested there by ICE. That's what a Christian nationalist movement, the one at a Christian majority, would look like. But it's not. It's a racist, white nationalist movement. And so all the alliances you would expect because of shared belief, pro-life belief, anti-gay belief, anti-trans belief, all these things that Christian nationalists say they want to roll back, that the Heritage Foundation dove in with Project 2025 about, they would be making alliance with Hispanic Christians and African Christians and others and trying to bring them in to bolster the numbers of evangelical Christians who are not having babies, who are having 1 or 2 children at most, like the rest of America, if at all. And they would be saying, we're going to welcome all these people. But that's not what they're doing. And so it's hard to take them seriously. My name is Frank Schaeffer. Hi, this is Frank Schaeffer, and I want to thank you for sharing my YouTube videos and for watching them. And I would ask you, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. It helps what I'm doing and get the word out. Thank you.